the avoidant person's sudden disconnection from you, their withdrawal when things seem to be going well, their creation of distance just as the relationship was deepening, was not random or meaningless. It was driven by profound fear that if the relationship continued, if you got close enough, if intimacy developed further, you would discover their secret, the truth about who they really are, underneath the carefully constructed facade of independence, self-sufficiency, and emotional control. This secret is not dramatic or scandalous in the conventional sense. It's not about hidden relationships or deceptions or terrible things they've done. The secret is far more fundamental and threatening to their defended identity. They're not actually as independent and self-sufficient as they present themselves to be. They have the same needs, fears, insecurities, and vulnerabilities as everyone else. They need connection and love and acceptance, just like any human. But they've built their entire identity around not needing these things, around being complete alone, around transcending the common human requirement for intimate bonds. The fear that you would discover this truth, that continued closeness, would reveal the needy, vulnerable, deeply wounded person beneath the independent exterior, became so overwhelming that disconnection felt like the only option. They had to push you away before you got close enough to see through their performance, before the mask slipped too far, before their true feelings and needs became undeniable. The disconnection was preemptive strike against the shame and exposure they feared would come if you discovered their secret. They protected their false identity at the cost of genuine connection. They chose maintaining the illusion over risking the vulnerability of being truly known. And in that choice, they ensured that they remain trapped in the very prison they've built to protect themselves, isolated by defenses that prevent exactly what they need most: being fully seen and still loved, being completely known with all their needs and vulnerabilities and still accepted. The disconnection was not rejection of you. It was desperate attempt to avoid the exposure that intimacy with you was threatening to create. The secret: they're not as independent as they pretend to be. The core secret the avoidant person desperately feared you would discover is that their entire presentation of independence, self-sufficiency, and not needing anyone is a carefully constructed defense rather than their authentic nature. Underneath the facade of someone who is perfectly content alone, who doesn't need emotional support or intimate connection, who is complete within themselves, lies someone who has the same human needs as everyone else, but who has learned to suppress, deny, and hide these needs because expressing them felt too dangerous. This secret is devastating to the avoidant person because their entire identity and sense of safety is built on maintaining the illusion of complete independence, and your increasing closeness threatened to expose this illusion as the defensive fiction it actually is. The avoidant person is not genuinely content with their isolated life, though they've convinced themselves and try to convince others that they are. They experience loneliness, longing for connection, desire for intimacy, need for emotional support and validation, all the normal human feelings and needs that drive people toward relationships. But they've learned to suppress conscious awareness of these needs, to minimize them, to tell themselves they don't really need what they're feeling pulled toward. This suppression is so automatic and so deeply ingrained that the avoidant person often genuinely believes their own narrative about not needing anyone, not recognizing that the need exists, even though it's been buried under layers of defensive denial. The specific way this secret manifests is that the avoidant person actually depends on others more than they acknowledge or than their independent presentation suggests. They depend on the people in their life for validation, for ego support, for the sense that they matter and are important, even if they don't depend on others, for emotional intimacy, or practical support in obvious ways. They need to know people care about them, want them, are impressed by them, even while maintaining enough distance that they don't have to reciprocate that care or meet others' needs. They depend on their work achievements, or their hobbies, or their possessions, or their status to provide sense of worth and identity, because they're not accessing worth through intimate relationships. They depend on their defensive strategies to manage anxiety and to prevent them from having to feel the painful emotions they're avoiding. All of these dependencies contradict their narrative about being truly independent and self-sufficient. The avoidant person's secret also includes that they're deeply affected by the people they claim not to need or care about that much. They think about their romantic partners more than they show. They miss people when they're apart, even while they're creating that apartness. They're hurt by rejection or by perceived abandonment, even while they're the ones pushing people away. They care about how people perceive them and what people think of them, despite pretending they're above such concerns. They're wounded by criticism, and they crave approval, despite their presentation of not caring what others think. All of these emotional responses reveal that they're not as detached or unaffected as they pretend, that people matter to them and impact them in ways they cannot acknowledge without threatening their defended identity. The secret includes that the avoidant person is terrified of abandonment and rejection, the very things their patterns seem designed to invite. They push people away, not because they don't fear loss, but because they fear it so intensely that they need to control it, to make it happen on their terms before it happens to them, to protect themselves from the unbearable pain of being truly vulnerable and then being left. Their defensive independence is not confidence that they're fine alone. It's desperate attempt to ensure they'll be fine alone because they believe abandonment is inevitable and they need to be prepared for it. This terror of abandonment, if you discovered it, would reveal that they're not the fearless, independent person they present as, but rather someone whose entire life strategy is organized around fear. The secret includes that the avoidant person needs you specifically far more than they can show or admit. They're not casually dating you while being equally content to date others or to be alone. They're actually quite attached to you. They think about you constantly. They want your attention and validation. They're affected by your responses to them. But showing this attachment would make them vulnerable. It would give you power over them. It would reveal that they need you, which would contradict everything about their self-presentation and would create the very vulnerability they've spent their life avoiding. So they hide their attachment, act more indifferent than they feel, maintain distance that doesn't reflect their actual feelings, all to protect themselves from you, discovering how much you actually matter to them. The avoidant person feared that continued intimacy with you would eventually expose all of this. The closer you got, the harder it would become to maintain the facade. You would start noticing the cracks, the inconsistencies between their words and their behaviors, the moments where their real feelings leaked through despite their attempts to control them. You would recognize that they're not as content alone as they claim when you noticed how they light up in your presence, or how they're checking whether you're paying attention to them. You would see through their indifference when you caught them being affected by something you said, or by your attention to others. You would discover that they need reassurance and validation when you noticed how they fish for compliments, or how they need to know they matter to you, even while they're pushing you away. The fear of this discovery is what drove the disconnection. The avoidant person recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that the relationship was reaching a point where maintaining the facade would become impossible. You were getting too close, seeing too much, understanding too deeply. The choice became either to drop the facade and allow you to see their real needs and vulnerabilities, which felt impossibly dangerous, or to disconnect before the exposure became complete. They chose disconnection because maintaining their defensive identity felt more important than maintaining the relationship, because the shame of being exposed felt more threatening than the loss of losing you, because protecting their secret seemed necessary for their survival, even though the secret was protecting them from exactly what they needed, being fully known and still loved. The fear that closeness would expose their true self, beyond the general secret of not being as independent as they pretend. The avoidant person feared that closeness with you would expose their true self in all its wounded, needy, flawed reality, and this exposure felt like a threat to their very existence. The avoidant person has constructed a false self, a presentation designed to appear together, in control, invulnerable, and this false self is what they show the world and what they need others to see and believe. But underneath this presentation is their true self, wounded, scared, deeply insecure, carrying trauma and unmet needs from childhood, desperate for connection but terrified of it, full of shame about who they really are. The fear of you discovering this true self and rejecting it was so overwhelming that disconnecting felt like necessary self-preservation. The avoidant person's true self includes their deep insecurity about being lovable or worthy. Despite whatever external success or attractive qualities they possess, the avoidant person fundamentally doubts that they're worthy of love, that anyone who truly knew them would choose to stay, that their authentic self is acceptable. This insecurity was formed in childhood through experiences where they learned that their needs were burdensome, that their authentic expression was met with rejection or dismissal, that love was conditional on them being easy, undemanding, self-sufficient. The insecurity persists into adulthood as core belief that if anyone truly knows them, sees their needs and wounds and limitations, that person will find them inadequate and leave. The false self they've constructed protects them from this feared rejection by presenting only the acceptable, impressive aspects while hiding everything vulnerable. The avoidant person's true self includes their emotional wounds and the pain they carry from past experiences. They're not the stoic, unaffected person they present as. They're deeply hurt by past rejections, by childhood experiences of not being seen or valued, by the loneliness their defensive patterns create, by the awareness that they're missing out on intimacy, even while they're choosing that missing out. But acknowledging this pain would require vulnerability. It would mean admitting they've been hurt, that things affect them deeply, that they're not as invulnerable as they pretend. Your increasing closeness threatened to bring you into contact with this pain, and the avoidant person feared that seeing their pain would make you perceive them as weak or damaged, that you would lose respect for them or would feel burdened by their wounds. The true self includes their actual emotional needs that contradict their independent presentation. The avoidant person needs reassurance, needs to feel important and valued, needs physical affection and emotional connection, needs support during difficult times, needs someone to witness and validate their experiences. These needs are normal and human, but the avoidant person has learned to see them as shameful weaknesses. They fear that if you discovered the extent of their needs, if you saw how much they actually want the very intimacy they're avoiding, you would perceive them as needy or demanding or as hypocritical given their presentation of not needing anyone. This fear judgment is so painful that they hide their needs even from themselves and certainly from you. The true self includes their loneliness and their longing for connection that their defensive patterns create. The avoidant person is not satisfied with their isolated life, even though they claim to be. They experience deep loneliness. They long for the intimacy they're avoiding. They wish they could be different and could allow themselves to connect fully. But admitting this loneliness would mean acknowledging that their defensive strategies are not actually serving them, that they're not actually happy with the choices they're making, that they need exactly what they're pushing away. Your closeness threatened to bring this recognition to the surface, to force them to see and feel the loneliness and longing they work so hard to suppress. The fear was that if you saw this loneliness, if you recognized how much they actually want what they're rejecting, it would expose how profoundly lost and confused they are. The true self includes their fears about relationships and intimacy that drive their defensive patterns. The avoidant person is terrified of being abandoned, of being hurt, of being controlled, of losing themselves in relationship, of becoming dependent and then being disappointed. These fears are so intense that they've organized their entire life around avoiding the situations that would trigger them. But acknowledging these fears would mean admitting they're driven by fear rather than by confident preference, that they're avoiding rather than choosing, that they're controlled by their wounds rather than being as free and independent as they claim. Your closeness would eventually reveal these fears because intimate relationship triggers all of them, and the avoidant person couldn't maintain the pretense that their withdrawal was preference rather than fear-driven avoidance if you were close enough to see their anxiety and their defensive maneuvers clearly. The true self includes the specific ways they've been wounded in past relationships and how those wounds still affect them. The avoidant person might have been betrayed or abandoned at crucial moments, or made to feel that their needs were too much, or criticized for their vulnerabilities. These experiences created lasting damage that shapes how they approach relationships now, but acknowledging this damage would require admitting that past hurts still affect them, that they haven't fully moved on or healed, that they're more wounded than their put-together exterior suggests. The avoidant person fears that if you knew their history and saw how it still impacts them, you would perceive them as damaged goods, as someone too broken to be worth the effort of loving. The fear of exposure of their true self is so intense because the avoidant person believes their true self is fundamentally unacceptable that if you really knew them, you would leave, or would lose respect for them, or would be disappointed by the gap between who they present as and who they really are. This belief is tragic and usually inaccurate. Most people who love someone want to know their true self and would respond to vulnerability with increased intimacy and acceptance rather than with the rejection the avoidant person fears. But the avoidant person cannot risk testing this, cannot allow themselves to be vulnerable enough to discover that their fears might be unfounded, because the possibility that their fears are correct feels too dangerous to survive. How they disconnected before you could discover their vulnerability. The avoidant person's disconnection from you was not impulsive or random. It was strategic, though often unconscious, protective maneuver designed to create distance before your increasing intimacy reached the point where their vulnerability would become undeniable and their secret would be exposed. Understanding the specific ways they engineered the disconnection, the timing of it, and the mechanisms they used reveals how much their behavior was driven by fear of exposure rather than by anything you did wrong or by genuine incompatibility. The timing of the disconnection is revealing. The avoidant person likely disconnected when the relationship was actually going well, when you were growing closer, when intimacy was deepening in ways that would typically signal positive relationship development. This timing seems counterintuitive until you understand that good relationship trajectory is exactly what triggers the avoidance fear. When things are going well, when closeness is increasing, the avoidant person recognizes that continued trajectory will lead to deeper intimacy that will expose their vulnerability. They must disconnect before this exposure occurs, which means disconnecting precisely when things seem most promising. Sabotaging the relationship before its success reveals their needs and fears. The disconnection often happened after specific moments of closeness or vulnerability that triggered the avoidant person's alarm system. Perhaps you had a particularly connected conversation where they shared more than usual. Perhaps you spent extended intimate time together that felt good, but also felt threatening in its intensity. Perhaps you expressed your feelings or your vision for the future in ways that made the relationship feel more real and more serious. Perhaps they noticed themselves feeling strongly about you in ways that revealed their own attachment. Any of these moments of increased intimacy or emotional exposure can trigger the avoidant person's fear response, and the disconnection follows as attempt to restore distance and control before things go further. The mechanics of the disconnection often include the avoidant person suddenly becoming very busy or unavailable. They might claim work is demanding more of their time, or they have personal issues to deal with, or they need space to focus on themselves. These explanations are sometimes true in the literal sense, but they're not the real reason for the distance. The real reason is that proximity to you has become too threatening, and they need physical and emotional space to restore their sense of safety. The busyness or the personal issues are convenient excuses that allow them to create distance without having to acknowledge the real reason, which would require vulnerability they cannot access. The disconnection includes emotional withdrawal that precedes or accompanies the physical distancing. The avoidant person becomes less emotionally present, less responsive to your emotional bids, less engaged in meaningful conversation. They might still see you, but they're not really there with you. This emotional withdrawal serves to reduce the intimacy even when physical proximity continues, creating protective buffer that prevents you from getting any closer to their vulnerable core. The emotional absence also serves to confuse and hurt you in ways that might make you pull back yourself, allowing the avoidant to create the distance they need without having to explicitly reject you. The disconnection often involves the avoidant person manufacturing reasons why the relationship isn't working or why you're not compatible. They suddenly focus on differences that didn't seem important before. They emphasize problems that could be worked through if they were willing to work on them. They frame the disconnection as being about external factors or incompatibilities rather than about their internal fear and defensive patterns. This reframing serves multiple purposes. It makes the disconnection seem rational rather than fear-driven. It protects their secret by avoiding any discussion of their vulnerability, and it makes you the problem or makes circumstances the problem rather than acknowledging that their patterns are sabotaging something that was actually working. The disconnection includes the avoidant person resisting or refusing any conversation about what's happening or why they're pulling away. If you try to discuss the distance, if you express concern about their withdrawal, if you ask what changed, the avoidant person stonewalls or offers minimal explanations or becomes defensive. This refusal to engage prevents any examination of their patterns or their fears. It keeps you from getting close enough to their internal experience to recognize what's actually driving their behavior. The stonewalling protects their secret by ensuring that the conversation never reaches depth where their vulnerability and their fears would have to be acknowledged. The disconnection is often accompanied by the avoidant person creating narrative about needing to focus on themselves, needing to be alone, not being ready for relationship, needing space to figure things out. This narrative frames the disconnection as being about their individual journey rather than about their fear of intimacy with you specifically. It sounds mature and self-aware, like they're prioritizing healthy self-development, but it's actually defensive maneuver that allows them to exit while maintaining their image as together person who is making conscious choices rather than someone who is running from intimacy because they're terrified of being truly known. The disconnection sometimes includes the avoidant person suggesting staying friends or maintaining some form of contact that's less intimate than romantic relationship. This suggestion serves to reduce the intensity of connection to level they can manage while still maintaining access to you and to the validation your attention provides. It allows them to keep you at safe distance, where you won't discover their vulnerability while still benefiting from your presence in their life. The friendship offer is presented as kindness or as way to preserve connection, but it's actually strategic positioning that protects their secret while preventing them from having to fully lose you, what they lost, by protecting a secret that wasn't shameful. The tragic irony of the avoidant person's disconnection from you to protect their secret is that the secret they were so desperately protecting, that they have needs and vulnerabilities and aren't as independent as they pretend, is not actually shameful and would likely have been met with acceptance and increased intimacy rather than the rejection they feared. By protecting this secret through disconnection, they ensured they lost something genuinely valuable while protecting something that didn't need protection. Understanding the specific losses they incurred reveals the devastating cost of their defensive patterns and the particular tragedy of pushing away someone who could have accepted their true self. The avoidant person lost the opportunity to be truly known and still loved. This is one of the deepest human longings, to be fully seen with all your vulnerabilities and wounds and needs, and to be accepted and loved not despite these, but with full awareness of them. You were offering this possibility. You were someone who could have seen their needs and their wounds and their fears, and who would likely have responded with compassion and acceptance, rather than with the judgment and rejection they feared. But by disconnecting before this full knowing could occur, they ensured they remain unknown, isolated behind their defenses, never experiencing the profound connection and healing that comes from being vulnerable and finding that vulnerability met with love. They lost the specific relationship with you, which represented rare combination of compatibility, understanding, and potential that they may not find again. Relationships where there's genuine connection, where the other person is willing to be patient and understanding, where there's actual compatibility beyond just surface attraction, are not common. You represented something valuable and potentially transformative, but the avoidant person sacrificed this because protecting their defended identity felt more important than exploring what could have developed if they'd allowed themselves to be vulnerable. The loss of you specifically is something they'll likely recognize more fully as time passes and as they fail to find connections that compare to what you offered. They lost the possibility of growth and healing that intimate relationship with safe person can provide. Relationships are not just about companionship and pleasure. They're vehicles for healing childhood wounds, for developing new patterns, for learning that intimacy can be safe, for discovering that you can be vulnerable and survive the vulnerability. You were safe enough that the avoidant person could have used the relationship to begin healing if they'd been willing to work with their fear rather than running from it. But by disconnecting, they ensured they remained stuck in the same patterns, missing the opportunity for the corrective emotional experience that could have shifted their attachment patterns toward greater security. They lost the chance to build something meaningful and lasting with someone who understood them. Intimate partnership provides depth of meaning that isolated life cannot replicate. Having someone who knows you deeply, who's building life with you, who's there through challenges and celebrations, who provides witness to your experiences and growth, creates sense of meaning and purpose that solitary pursuits struggle to match. The avoidant person often claims not to want or need this, but underneath their defenses, the desire for meaningful connection exists. By disconnecting from you, they chose continued isolation over the possibility of building something profound. They lost your trust and respect in ways that cannot be easily restored. Even if the avoidant person eventually recognizes their error and wants to reconnect, your experience of being disconnected from without adequate explanation or without being given chance to understand what was happening has damaged the foundation of trust. You learned that they will withdraw when things get difficult, or when they feel threatened, that they prioritize their comfort over the relationship's well-being, that they cannot communicate about their internal experience in ways that allow for mutual understanding. This damaged trust means that even if reconnection occurs, rebuilding what was lost would require sustained effort and change behavior that most avoidants are not capable of providing. They lost the specific moment in their life when this relationship could have developed. Timing matters in relationships. The person you were when you were with them, the circumstances of both your lives, the particular moment when you encountered each other. These create unique context that cannot be replicated. Even if the avoidant person later develops more capacity for intimacy, even if they eventually do the work to address their patterns, you won't be waiting, and the specific potential of what could have been at this time in both your lives is permanently lost. They lost the opportunity to learn that their fears about exposure were unfounded or manageable. The avoidant person feared that if you discovered their vulnerability, you would reject them or lose respect for them, but this fear was likely exaggerated or completely inaccurate. Most people respond to appropriate vulnerability with increased intimacy and connection. You would probably have accepted their needs and their wounds with compassion, would have appreciated their trust in showing you their true self, would have felt closer to them for letting you in. By never testing their fear, by disconnecting before the feared exposure could occur, the avoidant person ensured they never discover that vulnerability can be met with acceptance, reinforcing their fear-based patterns and guaranteeing they'll repeat them. They lost respect for themselves at some level that they may not consciously acknowledge. The avoidant person presents as confident and certain in their choices, but underneath there's often awareness that they're running from intimacy, that they're letting fear control them, that they're sacrificing what they actually want to protect themselves from what they fear. This awareness, even when suppressed, creates subtle erosion of self-respect. Part of them knows they're not being brave or authentic, that they're letting their wounds control their life, that they're disconnecting from someone valuable because they're too afraid to be vulnerable. This knowledge, buried under defensive rationalizations, creates shame and regret that affects their relationship with themselves. The most profound loss is that by protecting a secret that wasn't shameful, that they have normal human needs and vulnerabilities, they ensured they remain imprisoned by that secret. The secret maintains its power precisely because it's never exposed and tested. If they had allowed you to see their vulnerability and had discovered that you accepted it, the secret would lose its threatening quality. They would learn that being vulnerable doesn't lead to the catastrophic outcomes they fear. But by disconnecting to protect the secret, they reinforced its power, ensuring that they remain controlled by fear of exposure, guaranteeing that they'll repeat the same pattern of disconnecting before anyone gets close enough to truly know them, condemning themselves to continued isolation while simultaneously reinforcing the very fears that drive that isolation. The cost of protecting their secret was losing the one thing that could have freed them from it, your acceptance and love in the face of their complete, vulnerable, authentic self.